Hello, I'm Dr. Carl, and today I'm sitting in front of my brand new couch that I just got this week, and I, along with my wife and children, picked out these colors largely in honor of my beloved European Union. That's right, I am proud to have been a citizen of the European Union come January 1st for exactly 25 years. I'll never forget the moment I learned that I was going to become a citizen of the European Union. I was 3 months and 3 days too young to vote in the referendum. I was 17 years old and living as a high school exchange student in Switzerland. That evening, my host brother came down the stairs and said he had heard that the referendum had passed. Oh, the relief I felt and the excitement to know that I was going to become a citizen of the European Union. That Christmas and New Year's, I visited my grandparents, and I remember walking around New Year's Eve, the town, thinking to myself, by this time tomorrow, all of this is going to be in the European Union. And at the stroke of midnight, I still remember my grandmother turning to me and saying, "Now we are in the European Union." And I remember thinking to myself, no need to tell me, I already knew that one. Which brings me to the topic I want to discuss today, the conservative case in favor of the European Union. It breaks my heart that in recent times, so many of the right-of-center pundits in Britain and the United States and in other countries as well have become so anti-EU. People with whom I agree with on pretty much all other issues are just dead wrong about this. By contrast, in more recent years, those on the left whom I tend to disagree with on everything have been actually quite right about this one. So, in order to see how we got to this place, let's look at the history. While the idea of a federation of European states could probably trace back centuries, the recent example came from the ashes of World War II. Many leaders realized that the best way to prevent war between the countries of Europe was to create a federation of European states. It was none other than that conservative icon, Winston Churchill, a man who repeatedly warned us about the dangers of socialism, suggested a federation of European states. Shortly after that, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman on May 9th, 1950, that's why May 9th is Europe Day, suggested that very thing. These were not left-of-center men. On the contrary, these were right-of-center men. And indeed, the 6 founding member states back in the 1950s tended to have right-of-center governments. So no, this was not founded based on socialism or socialist ideas, and is certainly not the EUSSR some have preposterously suggested. Indeed, I remember once seeing the Washington Times in an editorial saying that the European Union is just one word away from Soviet Union. Yeah, well, that one word difference is Europe versus Soviet. Is anything with the word union like the Soviet Union? Of course not. But at any rate, if it truly was a socialist-based organization, then why is it that the then communist countries of Eastern Europe were not able to join? Certainly Yugoslavia. After all, Yugoslavia was not in the Warsaw Pact and had stronger ties with Western Europe than the other countries did, which had more stronger ties to the Soviet Union. So, at any rate, they were not allowed to join until after communism collapsed in 1989 and the break of the Soviet Union in 1991. Several years later, in Copenhagen, Denmark, the Copenhagen criteria was outlined. Under the Copenhagen criteria, in order for the now ex-communist countries to join, they had to fulfill 4 criteria. The first one's pretty obvious. You had to be a European country. Another one is you had to respect human rights. But listen to the other 2. You had to be a functioning multi-party democracy, and you had to have a functioning free market economy. In other words, you had to be a capitalist country. Does that sound socialist to you? And indeed, throughout the history of the European Union, up until the last 10 years or so, it was more often the right that was pro-European Union than the left. After all, it was the Tory party in the 1970s that brought Britain into the European Union in the first place. It was the Tory party under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s that brought Britain onto the Single European Act. It was the Tory party in the 90s under John Major, a man I actually had the pleasure of meeting once, who brought Britain onto the Maastricht Treaty. And by the way, Britain was brought into the European Union over the objections of Labour. Labour did not officially drop their objections to British membership in the European Union until the late 80s. And I would also like to point out that this has been true in other European countries. For example, in the case of Sweden, it was the right that really pushed to bring Sweden into the European Union over the objection of the Left Party, which used to be known as the Communist Party, and the Green Party. Likewise, it was the right in Greece under New Democracy that brought Greece into the European Union over the objections of PASOK, the Socialist Party of Greece. More recently, it was the right that brought Malta into the European Union over the objections of the left-wing Labour Party. And I can remember being in Sweden back in the 90s and the early noughties, arguing largely against leftists why the European Union is a good thing. And of course, I should mention the great Helmut Kohl, a right-wing leader of Germany who fought hard to expand the European Union into Eastern Europe and to bring about the euro. And I also want to point out, I've touched on left-wing objections to the European Union, especially far left. The Communist or ex-Communist Party in Sweden opposed EU membership. The Communist Party of France opposed the Nice Treaty, calling it neoliberal. Now, for those of the United States, the term liberal is misused in the United States. Liberal does not mean left of center or even change. It means basically libertarian, or that's kind of what it's supposed to mean. And I also wanted to point out, this is one of several times in politics where we see the far left and far right in agreement. In terms they both tend to not like the European Union. And as we know, anytime the far right and far left agree against the center right and the center left, it's almost certainly bad news. So, you may be saying to yourself, well, Dr. Carl, I'm with you so far. Sounds like the European Union was started by the right people for the right reasons, perhaps did a lot of good, but what about the monster that it's become? Well, you're wrong there too. First of all, let's look at some of the facts, shall we? The European Union employs roughly 34,000 people. Now, to put that in perspective, that's barely 1,000 people per member state. The British government, by contrast, employs about 6 million. Now, where are the unelected bureaucrats? Also, the European Union's annual budget is quite small, and Britain's contribution is a minuscule part of Britain's national budget. If Britain wanted to spend £350 million a week more on healthcare, there was nothing stopping Britain from doing it. That money could easily have been found from other points of the budget, or raise your national budget by £350 million a week if you must. But the European Union was not stopping Britain from spending more money on healthcare, or anything else for that matter. Also, there are not all these onerous rules coming from Brussels over the objections of the British government. For example, several studies were done that found between 11 to 13% of laws in Britain came from the European Union. Now, it can be kind of hard to determine whether a law came from the European Union or not. So what these studies did was they cast the widest net possible. If a law so much as mentioned the European Union, even as a reference point, it was counted. So the actual number will probably be well below 11 to 13%. And in order for legislation to pass the European Union, it has to pass the appropriate Council of Ministers in the Council of Ministers. And while there's no longer a national veto, Britain has been on the winning side of Council of Minister votes well over 90% of the time since the mid-90s. So the vast majority of the few laws that have come from Brussels to Britain were approved by the sitting British government at the time. I also wanted to address some of these Euro myths. Probably the most infamous one is straight bananas. At one point, the European Union adopted a rule to regulate the size and shape of bananas being sold in the European Union. That's ridiculous, you might say, and well, yeah, it is. But why was that done? Well, the European countries that had former colonies in the Caribbean wanted to favor the Caribbean bananas over the Central and South American bananas, and the shapes of the bananas are a little bit different. Now, it couldn't pass a policy to outright do that because, for obvious reasons, the Central and South American countries would say, hey, that's unfair trade. Well, I like to point out to opponents of the European Union and Britain that along with France, it was Britain that fought for that. Why? Because Britain has a lot of former colonies in the Caribbean. Also, there was another Euro myth that the European Union was going to call overturned dirt hazardous waste. That was a reference to chemical waste sites. That's not a reference to you planting a tree in your backyard. And again, there are plenty of other ridiculous Euro myths like this. But what does the European Union do? Well, a lot of good things. For example, it has brought the countries of Europe together in a spirit of peace, reminding these countries of their common European Western civilization, cultural heritage, while also emphasizing the differences. I mean, the European Union has done a lot to promote the use of minority languages and smaller national languages. Also, it has allowed for free trade and free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. I myself have taken advantage of my European Union citizenship to live and study in other European Union countries. So basically, it's great to bring the countries of Europe together based on a common European and Western civilization heritage, while at the same time remembering their unique differences. So that brings us to where we are now. It does seem like it's going to be almost impossible to stop Britain from leaving on January 31st. However, I still hold out a tiny bit of hope that that could still be stopped, or at least quickly reversed. And for one thing, it seems that that is now going to lead to Scottish independence, which could lead to Welsh independence, which could lead to England rethinking this whole thing if Scotland breaks away and rejoins and Wales breaks away and rejoins. I know I would dearly love to see Britain stay in the European Union or rejoin as soon as possible. So I hope I've outlined why supporting the European Union makes sense for those of us on the right. It makes sense for those on the left too. It makes sense for everybody. It's a fabulous idea and a fabulous institution, and I'm proud to be a citizen of it. I'm Dr. Carl. Enjoy.